You do present in Teams?
What? Okay. All right, I'm gonna go ahead and admit all.
I was out here, we had to get the ROC involved, and we won, which will explain why the building.
Hey guys, we're gonna get started in just a few. If you don't have your phone on mute or your computer on mute, if you could please mute for me. Let's go ahead and get started. So this is the third webinar of our series of 3 onboarding for our BEAD subgrantee. Today we have RSM going over some of the financials, some of the budget things for you guys. As always, if you have any questions, please feel free to drop them in the chat, or we'll leave some time at the end of the call to go over those as well. You should have also received an email from William with a link to our updated website that has all of our webinars. We'll have all of the subgrantee information kind of dumped onto that page, so you have a one-stop shop. But from there, we'll go ahead and kick off, and I'll turn it over to David with RSM.
Thanks, Sarah. Thanks, everybody. Jaron, if you could go ahead and share our slides, please, that would be great. All right, so as Sarah mentioned, today we're going to be covering budgets and the payment process. For many of you, this will be a refresher if you've participated in the state's CPF or broadband infrastructure programs. There are some differences as it relates to the payment process. However, the budget worksheet is pretty similar to the one that you guys will have been used to from the past programs. But for those of you who are new, we will walk through both the detailed budget worksheet and talk through the payment process, the different milestones that are going to be included therein. So if you could skip to the next slide, Jaron, cover our agenda. So again, we'll walk through the objectives, which I really just covered. We are going to quickly revisit the program timeline just to kind of orient ourselves, remind us where we are in the process. Then we will talk through the final detailed budget worksheet submission. We'll talk through match funds, since, as you know, match funds are associated and a requirement of the BEAD funds, but were not previously incorporated in CPF and BBI. So that will be something that will be new for you guys to tackle if you've already participated in the state's program. We'll talk through the budget adjustment process very briefly. There are these being fixed subawards. There are a few basically thresholds that we apply to the adjustment process, and don't anticipate a significant amount of adjustments considering the nature of these awards. Then we'll go into the payment request process, and then we do have a link to some additional resources, and we'll definitely have time for questions because we don't have a full hour worth of content to cover. So you can skip to the next slide, Jaron. Hi, everybody again. David Luker, partner here at RSM. Jen, director with us, who you guys all know and has presented the past webinars. And Jaron will also be presenting some content today as one of our grant specialists and somebody who helped develop a lot of the tools that we used in CPF and the initial broadband programs. So webinar objectives, I'm not going to beat this slide up again, so we'll just skip this. As I stated, we're focusing on the budget submission and the payment request process. Just to reorient ourselves, we have not yet been notified that the state has received NIST approval yet, so we are still awaiting that, which will then trigger the award notification, which will include your terms and conditions, your SAO, State Accounting Office Supplier Management forms, which we're going to talk about in a little bit, which will be a really important step for you to tackle early so that when you are eligible to submit your first payment request, that process has been completed, and you can actually get a disbursement sent out to you. And then as we get to the end of this presentation today, we'll talk about the post-award onboarding and EHP steps and those communications and how those will factor into the budget and payment process. So, Jaron, if we could skip to the next slide. Okay, so we're going to start with the detailed budget worksheet. For those of you who have participated in the program, this snippet that you see on the right, you'll recognize that. Jaron's going to go through that in a minute. However, just want to cover at a high level the fact that each of you will be required to submit this detailed budget worksheet, identifying all costs associated with the project, both your funds directly being paid for through the program, but also your match funds will have to be tracked, because you can see in the screenshot here, and Jaron will show that column to you when we get to the actual walkthrough of the tool. But we will be tracking match, and match does have compliance requirements associated with it as well. So it is important that you guys understand how to bifurcate that on your payment request, and that those costs are being tracked appropriately. So Jaron, if we could skip to the next slide, I want to cover this briefly, and then I'll let you walk through the tool. So as I mentioned in that timeline, as soon as you receive the notification of award and your terms and conditions, that will include a package of information, and you will submit your budget along with that, basically the response to that process. And you should ensure that that final budget worksheet includes all of the equipment associated with the project. And what we'll share as we look at, as Jaron shares the tool, some of you will remember the different sections that we have that are based on the federal budget categories. Many of the costs in the prior programs were loaded into section 6, which we'll go through. And we really need those to be broken out, specifically as it relates to the equipment components because of the BABA requirements associated with this grant. So the budget submission process is not a BABA exercise. It is a budget submission process where we will review the budget. It is not a BABA compliance exercise. However, it is the right time for you to start thinking about and at the budget submission process, attempt to break out as much of the equipment that is going to be put in place as a part of the project on this submission so that we set ourselves up for success when we get into the actual execution of the work and monitoring of that equipment for compliance. The final detailed budget worksheet will get submitted to our BEAD inbox within 30 days of execution of the grant agreement. Please note that, of course, we will perform a review of those budgets and perform curing back and forth with you if any of the base content or is incorrect, or we have any questions about the quantities, the unit prices, or other details within the budget. So Jaron, if you wouldn't mind, I'll ask you to share the detailed budget worksheet and just briefly walk through each of the major categories and the different attributes that we're looking to acquire through this initial submission.
Excellent, thank you. So what I've pulled up here is our template filled out with some sample data from a grant, made up grant. So in the top here, we have some detail about points of contact, grant information. And then just to first give an overview here, we have the categories, personnel, fringe, travel, and then we get down into equipment, supplies, contracts, and other. We'll be able to go through each of those, but this aligns with the the same detailed budget that has been issued for the SFRF program and the capital funds program. And you'll also notice here we have costs attributed to the grant and costs attributed to match. So for each of these, we have some basic information. For example, in personnel, we have a listing of the personnel, the salary, and then that would calculate out into the amount covered by the grant versus the amount covered by match. So if this section was used, that's where it would be filled out. Fringe benefits, if applicable, could be detailed here. We have the different types of fringe broken out as well. The ability to do that in the budget worksheet. Any travel that would be affiliated with the grant. And then we get into equipment, supplies, and contracts, which are likely the most common expenses that would be incurred here. In the equipment section, we have the cost per unit, the number of units, and also, if known at the time of the budget, the vendor that would be selected for obtaining that equipment. This all calculates out into a total cost for the grant and per match. The same form follows for supplies in the section here. So in this, here we have things like fiber or ONT equipment. Then for contracts, consultants, and subawards would be any contracted services following a similar format of cost per unit. In some cases, this unit is one, as it's something like labor. Then that gets calculated out to the amount per the grant or per match. This all rolls up into the bottom summary here. This table summarizing the costs per the grant and per match is bifurcated in the detailed budget. And then there's an additional opportunity to provide some justification for things that are not detailed in the numbers, could be explained in the budget narrative below.
Thank you, Jaron. Can you pop back to the slides for me? All right. So one thing that I just wanted to make sure that I reiterated that came up in prior programs and that is always a question is the level of detail necessary to be provided in that workbook that Jaron just showed. Our kind of standard language in the past and still is the greatest level of detail that you have available at the time that you submit the budget adjustment or the budget worksheet. Obviously, we are trying to get to a level where we have individual unit quantities and individual unit prices to the deepest level possible, but we totally understand that some of these things are budgeted, you guys don't even have agreements in place. And so we understand that this is a budget. The budget may change, and we will cover in a subsequent slide the budget adjustment process. So I just wanted to reiterate the level of detail and kind of what we're looking for there. Jaron, if we could skip to the next slide. So Jen, if you wouldn't mind covering match funds for us, since this is a new concept to most of these grantees.
Perfect, thanks. So those of you that have attended the prior webinars that we've conducted, we have touched on the match funds. Obviously, if you're sitting in these webinars, you are provisionally awarded subrecipient, so you're aware of the match requirement that is outlined under the BEAD program. What is different from this program is that the eligible entity or the state of Georgia is required to actually monitor the spend and the documentation of the match funds. This slide is in many of our other webinars, so I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time talking through the match requirement and the eligible sources because we're already past this, but this again just highlights what the requirement is, the eligible sources of match that you all would have had to provide within your application. So we can move to the next slide. Perfect. For all types of match, there are two different types that you could have utilized for this program. There are a cash match and then there's in-kind match. But for all or both of these types of matches, subrecipients should make sure that they have accurate records that make reference to the source, the amount, the quantity, time, and delivery of each match service or goods, equipment, property, etc. Retain records throughout the life of the grant and the grant closeout, because again, we will be requiring you to, within your payment request, throughout the life cycle of the actual grant program, be asking you for these, even in the field on the compliance and monitoring side. Ensure that the match submission requires a legally binding attestation, which you've done in your application. And then this is just a letter of commitment for match that, again, were also outlined within your application. Really want to highlight for those of you that are utilizing the cash match option with this. For the cash match, we will request bank and financial statements. So just making sure you have those readily available and that you're tracking the spend down of your cash match, making sure that you can show the available spend on those funds. It's going to be extremely important. And then receipts from disbursements of that as well. So we'll give you more information too if that doesn't match when you're doing a payment request based on the milestones. But specifically, again, for cash match, making sure that you have documentation to show the spend and where you're at in the cash match that you put forth in your application, and that will also be linked within your terms and condition agreement. The other source that I mentioned that some of you did take advantage of was the in-kind match, and it's a third party or subrecipient, essentially a donation of property, goods, or services. And in this, these are just a couple of key considerations here for anybody who has volunteer services, and really noting if you have services that are donated either by the subrecipient like yourselves or third party, that you're making sure that you're using tools to compare those like the Bureau of Labor Statistics to determine the wage. I'll share with you in a moment kind of why this is applicable and important. For anything that's reduced rates, just making sure that you've compared those against current standards and other labor rates. And then for facilities or any kind of construction, just making sure that you're verifying those against the type of valuation methodology. Jaren, I'm going to share the screen briefly, if you don't mind. So all of these are in accordance with 2 CFR 200-306, which is your cost sharing. I just want to point you all to this because it's quite lengthy and it depends on the type of in-kind match that you're using. Some of you may just be using equipment, which falls under either property or goods. Some of you might have donated designs, which falls under services. However, all of these come with different 200.306 cost sharing requirements. Again, I'm not going to read them all to you, but I want to point out a couple of these that are going to be really important as you're working through this and reading through this. They do fall in line with subpart E of 2 CFR. So while these are fixed subawards, they do have to be allowable under subpart E, even though the fixed award portion of this is not applicable to the providers. So that just means making sure they're verifiable, which again, we're really enforcing here, document, making sure that they're not included as contributions for any other federal awards. And right, so that may be a question that gets brought up on accruing for a payment request or in the field. Making sure they're necessary and reasonable for achieving the objectives of the BEAD program. And I've already mentioned the subpart E and making sure they're allowable there. They're not paid by the federal government under another federal award, except where the program's federal authorizing statute specifically provides that they can be. And again, that slide that we flashed before that many of you are already familiar with from the application process, there are certain instances where certain CARES funds, state fiscal recovery funds under ARPA, et cetera, are allowable to be utilized for the cost sharing portion of this. So those would be allowable. They're provided for in the approved budget when required by the federal agency, because again, the eligible entity or the state of Georgia is actually going to submit these to the NTIA. So they will be also tracking these as well. So it will be a part of the state's overall budget for NTIA under the BEAD program. And then lastly, under number 7, conform to the other applicable provisions of this part. I know that's a lot. And again, we're happy to answer any questions, but I do want to skip down to the valuation. So in the compliance and monitoring phase of this, as well as the budget, we might ask for the recipients or subrecipients' values for contributions of services, property, or goods in this. And it depends on Whether, again, I mentioned it's property, goods, or services. It may fall under fair market value, et cetera. And it also depends on if it is the subrecipient donating the in-kind portion of goods, property, or services, or if it's a third-party donation of property, goods, and services. And so you can see of all the two CFRs, this is actually not as lengthy. So I would just highlight this as a reading material for those of you that have utilized in-kind match specifically. As you can see here, donated property from third parties may include items like equipment and supplies, et cetera. And this does align here assessed by fair market value at the time of the donation. Then it goes on to outline things for determining the value of donated equipment, et cetera. Buildings are valued a little bit differently and has some more down here. So again, just making sure that you're understanding twofold, whether it's subrecipient donation of goods, properties, or services, or if it's, subrecipient or a third party, makes a big difference. So again, as you can see, this is not as lengthy, but I would go back through here and make sure you understand the cost sharing requirements and how the valuation, the documentation of all this is going to be utilized in the field as we're doing the compliance and monitoring on this. I'm gonna stop sharing, Jaren, so you can go ahead and pull that back up. And again, the recurring theme here is going to be documenting everything. So I'll kick it back over to you, David.
All right. Get the slides advanced to where we left off. All right. So as I mentioned, we don't anticipate a significant amount of adjustments to the budget. If you could skip to the next slide, I usually am not a read the slide kind of a guy, but I do think that it's important to say these out loud because these are the exact parameters in which we will entertain a budget modification, and really we want to limit it to these types of circumstances. So first, a budget adjustment must be initiated if the proposed cumulative change is greater than 10% of the total award amount. That next part of the sentence doesn't matter because we don't have any awards less than $100,000. A budget adjustment must be initiated if the proposed change within any budget category is greater than 10% of the category total. And then the budget modification changes the scope of the project. There will also be a scope adjustment form, which we're not going to cover today because we really don't anticipate scope adjustments on these projects, considering we have isolated the specific BSLs that are to be served and don't expect that to change. However, as some of you know, we do have a process if in fact there is some unique circumstance and a scope adjustment is required. A budget adjustment affects an eligible cost category that was not included in the original budget. Obviously, we would hope that initially this detailed budget submission captures all of the correct categories that you anticipate. But if in fact you do have costs that will be heading into another category that you previously didn't allocate funds to, regardless of any percentage, that adjustment would be required to be submitted and reviewed and approved. So, Jaren, if we could skip to the next slide. This link takes you to the current budget adjustment form that is branded for the Governor's Office of Planning and Budget, who administered the broadband infrastructure and CPF funds. But that link is still going to be really representative of the final form that we use for budget adjustments in BEAD. So feel free to navigate to that and take a look. It's really not a very big document, 2 pages, a couple of questions that really just seek to capture both the narrative and the fiscal changes associated with the budget. Okay, so now we're going to go into the payments process. I will qualify a bit of this in that obviously we have not gone through the process of updating the tool that you may be accustomed to seeing for current payment requests. So we will not be sharing today a demo of that tool, but we will tab through the existing tool because we do anticipate it to look very similar, and we just want you guys to have a feel for what that looks like, especially those of you who have never submitted a request for reimbursement from the state. But just to reiterate, the state's utilizing a fixed subaward structure with performance-based milestones. So under this structure, subawards are not required to comply with the cost principles that Jen just was making reference to in subpart E. And these performance-based milestones will require a certain number of locations passed to receive funding once we get to a certain point. So this next slide, I'm going to walk you through that. So the first milestone is the 10% funding milestone, and this will be available after you have successfully completed the initial kickoff meeting with the state. So as you may recall, if you tabbed all the way back to our timeline, you will be receiving a request to schedule an initial kickoff meeting to talk through your onboarding, T's and C's, and any other housekeeping items. Once that meeting is completed and your vendor setup activities have been completed through the SAO form process, you will receive the payment request template, and you will then be able to access the portal and submit your first payment request for that first 10% of funds. To get to 25% of the funds, so for the next 15%, that is going to be predicated based on a completed design. Field surveys may be applicable for portions of the project, and so we've tied those to this milestone as well. The way that we will define completed design is by the submission of final GIS line work with all the required attributes after we have conducted the environmental and historic preservation meetings with your teams. So once we've all agreed on the final path, we've adjusted the path for any historic properties or challenging federal or other property. That final submission of line work will constitute the trigger for this additional 15%. And yes, I did see a question. I know we got a lot of questions, so we'll get those at the end. But yes, in addition to that submission of final line work, an engineer certification that the line work is complete at that time, similar to the certifications that were provided in the original application. The field survey component of this, I just want to touch on a little bit more. So as I mentioned, we'll be going through the EHP process with you, where we'll be looking at your GIS line work and focusing in on areas of importance or potential risk. And so during that process, if your project is potentially going to impact a sensitive area, that area may be subject to a field survey that would be required as a condition precedent to your design being completed. That may not happen in your project's case. It just depends on the line work, and we've got to dig in and get into those one-on-one meetings to determine if that is going to be applicable. The next 10%, funding up to 35%, is going to be tied to the NTIA's approval of the NEPA decision memo related to the ESAPT process that we have explained on a prior webinar. So basically, you've got to perform your clash detection. You've got to perform or respond to the questionnaire. We've got to submit all those questions to the NTIA. They've got to perform their review of the environmental responses that you've prepared, we've prepared jointly. And then they will issue approval of the decision memo that was the culmination of our work in the ESAPT tool. So Once that is complete, you would then be eligible to request up to 35% of funding. The other permits as applicable bullet here is really just a placeholder in the event that any of the clashes or any of the curing from the NTIA results in specific areas of the project or specific permits that are of importance to the entire group. That may be an isolated instance where one permit or one area of the project could have to present either the results of the consultation or obtaining the actual permit prior to that step. But we're hopeful that the NTIA approval of the decision memo is really the determining piece of support for that request. So I'm going to hand the remainder of the budget to Jaron, as he will explain when we get into the locations and passing locations and kind of how that submission process works. So Jaron, if you wouldn't mind taking it away.
Absolutely, thank you. So after the first few milestones are met, to obtain the remainder of funding is based on project completion. Project completion is measured by past locations and miles installed. A location is considered passed or served when service is available to that location. And similarly, a mile is considered completed and installed when the locations along that line are able to receive service. I'll show the current payment template, which will only have a few small modifications for the BEAD program, but I'll walk you through that as well. In order for a grantee to assert locations passed and miles completed, you'll submit the latitudes and longitudes, and for locations also the fabric ID of those locations passed along with the pay request. With those locations, we do check whether or not how those tie to the approved list, and also at intervals throughout the project, validate that the locations submitted as served are showing in the fabric as served. That's done at intervals and not at every pay application. We know that there's an interval for that map to be updated, but it'll be reviewed at intervals and then also at closeout. So I'll talk through some of these percentages and then show the payment request template. In order to receive up to 50% of funding, there's a 35% spread between the past locations and miles completed and the funding requested. So I think that's best demonstrated with an example. So if you had, let's say, 12% of miles completed and 10% of locations passed, you would take the lesser of those two, add 35%, and then that would be the maximum amount able to be requested. So in that case, that would be 45%. In the next phase, after 50% of funding has been received, that spread shrinks to 15%. So similarly, if you had 62% and 60% of miles or locations completed, you would add 15% and be looking at a maximum of 75% of funding able to be requested. The last 5, that would get you to 95%, and the last 5% would be a reconciliation to the national broadband map and to the fabric to see that those locations are being shown as served as part of our closeout process for the grant. So I'm going to shift gears here to pull up the payment template. What you're looking at now is the payment template for the SFRF and CPF programs, which will have a few small modifications to accommodate for BEAD. The first tab here includes instructions and an FAQ, including some of the things we talked about today, such as the definition of a completed mile at a past location. Next, we have a summary page. This includes some details about the point of contact and the grant up here that the grantee would fill out. And then these fields are auto-populated by the supporting tabs, which we'll walk through. They flow through to the summary page. And then lastly, an attestation of accuracy by a point of contact at the grantee. Going through the tabs, we have a detail of the miles completed. The starting and end point of the mile completed would be described with the starting latitude and longitude, beginning the run and the end of the run, and then also being sure to include the distance that run covers, as the metric is calculated on miles, but we'll convert it based on feet. In locations, this is one area where we'll have an additional column here for fabric ID, but you would detail the latitude and longitude of the locations passed and service made available to. That list would then be reconciled to the awarded location list and then ultimately to the fabric. The remaining tabs align, you'll recognize from the detailed budget. We have personnel and fringe with similar details as outlined in the detailed budget. Travel expenses also present in the detailed budget. Equipment, supplies, with the description of the supplies, the quantity of the supplies, and the amount correlating to those. Consultants, contracts, and subawards, and then the other category as well. So these match up to the detailed budget to be able to track expenditures against the budget.
All right, thanks, Sharon. You should throw the slide back up and we can wrap up. Well, while Jaron tabs through 22 slides to get us to where we left off. No, thanks, that was quick. Okay, so as we mentioned earlier, the submission of that spreadsheet or the updated version of that spreadsheet will be done through the Georgia Grants portal, which you will all have access to. And I want to this snapshot on the screen shows you a bit of what the portal looks like, just a quick shot. We, of course, during our onboarding and one-on-one meetings can provide more technical assistance around this, and we'll have more access to like a training video and things like that as we progress. But for right now, this is what you get to see. But I did want to highlight that second to last sentence here about the supplier change management forms and these funds being dispersed through SAO. I saw a question in the chat about this as well. Great question. Getting that vendor management information together and updated into SAO quickly is very important, because you won't be able to get paid even if we are able to process a compliant payment request on our side. So, Jaron, if you could skip to the next slide. As I mentioned, we will have some additional resources coming your way with the onboarding awardee email, as well as the EHP and other subsequent communications. I know this deck will go out as well with these links. I think, Jaron, I think that's the last slide, right? Open it up for Q&A, and I do see that Jen, yeah, if you have any questions, obviously send them here, but I know some have been posted up. I think I saw Jen may have responded to some in the chat, but
Yeah, I'm gonna go to the chat first real quick, if you don't mind. And then I'll open the floor up for hands raised, because I did answer a few of them that were just like easy hits here. So I want to start with the first, which is, will match be tracked for each payment milestone, which then again was qualified at the bottom to say, trying to read through it here. Will it be tracked for each milestone essentially? And the answer here is, for match, it'll be tracked against the payment requests that correspond to the milestone. So in that, we will ask you for the documentation on the spend of the cash match or the in-kind. And then I wanted just to make sure to reiterate too, that throughout the life cycle of the project, that's where the documentation of the valuation methodology, et cetera, will come into play. Go back up to the top here. Next question here in the chat. When you refer to the equipment list, are you referring to the bill of materials? If so, getting an equipment list for some of our projects will be very challenging to provide prior to contract execution, which I know you mentioned earlier, as well as we will need to go through data collection, network design, write out an environmental prior to finalizing design plans.
Yep, we appreciate that, understand that, and that's why I made the comments that I did around we understand that this is a budget and you're taking your best shot at preparing it with the information that you have in front of you. So understood.
Perfect. Next question, will the budget template be available soon so we can go ahead and begin completing it based on our application? I can answer that one. That one's yes, we will provide you the template so you can begin the coordination. And again, as David mentioned kind of in the beginning, which answers a couple of these questions below it as well, you will receive, once the state gets NIST approval and has everything ready to turn over to everyone, you will receive an email with a notice of award, and that will outline a lot of the housekeeping items, including access to the grants management system, the SAO vendor process, which I know is also embedded in a question here, so I'll just go ahead and answer that. That process, again, will be outlined within that notice of award. The form is available, so you can kind of get familiar with what you will need to supply to SAO and OPB for that. But there's something else I want to say in that. So for those of you that have participated or are already registered as vendors with the state, you will also have to go through this again. It's just a state thing, so I'm gonna apologize in advance. You actually have to do this again, not to receive a different vendor number, but to receive a different location number, which is how the state identifies each grant within their system. So you will have to do it again. So apologies. I think I answered that one already. I apologize if this has been covered in a previous webinar, but if we have material already in stock, this has been covered, we can go ahead and definitely talk through this. Can we use that material? In previous grants in other states not BEAD, we've been able to use that material and then reimburse the invoices to replace the material. This would allow us to bypass lead times and service build out quicker. And so I'll let you talk through the BABA compliance.
Yeah, so I guess, the equipment used must be BABA compliant, whether it's existing stock or new. And so the answer to the question is, so long as that equipment can be certified as BABA compliant or is already subject to a waiver that's available for BABA, or is a product that you've already submitted through the self-certification process directly to the NTIA, if it passes one of those three tests, it can be utilized. But if it does not, and you cannot certify that it is BABA compliant, then it cannot be used towards the grant.
Perfect. I think this will be another question for you too, because as you guys were tabbing through that, clarification on the equipment tab for the $5,000 threshold for equipment and the increase in uniform guidance of 10,000 for defining equipment.
Yeah, this is a great catch, Marcy. Thank you. We'll update that to 10. It should have been updated, and that's a great catch. So of course we align with the uniform guidance here, and that 5,000 is just a carry forward. So yep. Great catch.
Carry over from the state fiscal and CPF as well. So this one is in regards to the fixed amount subawards. Will GTA pay out 100% of the award regardless of the project costs expended at project closeout, assuming 100% of locations have been passed? At least one state has made allowances for this approach.
Yes, the answer is yes. As Jaron walked through, 100% is based on the location served, not the cost that you incurred.
Then the next one, engineer cert equals PE question mark?
Correct.
I think I've already answered this as far as the vendor registration before the kickoff call. That will all be outlined in your notice of award. And so at that time, we are alerting SAO of the influx in these awardees. And so then you'll be able to initiate those. We definitely don't want you to go ahead and initiate that response just yet. We want to make sure the state wants to make sure that GTA gets NIST approval and that those provisionally awarded subrecipients are in fact notified of actual award for a final award. Already responded to, oh, here's a good one. Will a payment request template be provided for review before the kickoff meeting?
Yes.
Yeah.
You or me. Yes, the payment request template will be provided before the kickoff meeting.
Yep. I think it was covered on the last call too, but in the same vein as that question, you will get an email confirmation that you've completed, right, your checklist item of conducting the kickoff call that you will utilize to initiate the payment request actually in the system. Can you explain further what is defined as a sensitive area?
Sure, I can take this one. A sensitive area is really, we link this back to the 60-ish layers that exist in the Appiate clash detection tool. And so in our EHP breakouts with you, we will share the layers that we have highlighted as high, moderate, or low risk as it relates to project delay or other risk. But generally speaking, sensitive areas are those areas that have historic properties that are federally owned or that are under some type of environmental coverage, essentially. So those would be the three, but we'll get more specific with you in our breakouts with respect to exactly what we mean by sensitive area.
And Clinton, I see your clarification at the end there, so that makes sense. So for the first 3 milestones, you might be utilizing in-kind match while you also have cash match. The one thing I will say in requesting the payments based on the milestones is just making sure that you are prepared to provide the documentation again for the valuation methodology, and you've done the calculation on fair market value, and you've done the comparison, and make sure that any of the donated services, et cetera, or employees that you're utilizing under the services have been compared to the Bureau of Labor statistics that I mentioned earlier. So again, just document. Okay. I'm going to close the chat for now, and anybody with their hands up, I'm going to go and look and see if we have any other questions. I don't see any hand raised.
I'm linking the BABA waiver for Wendy Lawson.
Perfect. All right. So David did send that link in the chat. Any other questions? All right, Sarah, I'm going to turn it back over to you to close us out.
Great, and I am going to put the link to our updated website in the chat now. This is where we're going to put all of the information that you guys will need as you're moving through the process of getting this grant kicked off. We should have our webinars, our previous ones up there already, and then we'll put today's up there as soon as possible. If you have any questions in the interim, certainly feel free to reach out to us. We've got those 2 general email addresses. The GTA's is broadband@gta.ga.gov, and RSM is gabead@rsm. I don't remember the rest.
us.com.
us.com. I was so close. But feel free to shoot us emails to either of those, and we'll make sure to follow up on those individual questions. Thank you so much for participating in today. We will let you know as soon as additional information regarding NIST approval is available. And until then, have a good one. Thanks, guys. Bye.
Thanks, Sarah.
Thank you.